I'm Deborah Holdstein. I have the privilege of being the Dean of the School of Liberal Arts and Sciences here at Columbia College, Chicago. And I started the Dean's Lecture in 2009. It happens twice yearly, once in the fall, once in the spring. And I like to bring in a scholar or noted thinker from outside our community, and in the spring, we try to feature someone from among our own wonderful faculty members for that particular lecture. Tonight, we're very pleased to welcome Dr. Kathleen Fitzpatrick, about whom I'll tell you in a moment. First, I want to thank Dr. Susan Marcus for being here from Academic Affairs, and Dr. Warren Chapman, our Senior Vice President of Columbia College, Chicago. And I acknowledge the rest of you all in one fell swoop. In the spring, we optimistically call our second semester spring, even though it begins at the dead of January. In February, our spring Dean's Lecture will feature Dr. Stephen Corey talking to us about garbage, because he is a historian of garbage, and we look forward to that lecture as well. Dr. Corey is the chair of our Department of Humanities, History, and Social Sciences. So, on to this particular lecture. There will be Q&A after the lecture, and we hope you'll stick around for a very nice reception and some music afterwards as well. Dr. Kathleen Fitzpatrick is Director of Scholarly Communication at the Modern Language Association. Now, if you don't know what the MLA is, it's fair to say that it is to scholars and teachers of literature, language, rhetoric, composition, and related fields what the American Medical Association is to physicians, and probably much more. She's also visiting research professor of English at New York University. She's the author of Planned Obsolescence, Publishing, Technology, and the Future of the Academy, which was published in 2011 by NYU Press. And she's also the author of The Anxiety of Obsolescence, the American Novel in the Age of Television, published by Vanderbilt University Press in 2006. Dr. Fitzpatrick is also the co-founder of the digital scholarly network Media Commons, where she has led a number of experiments in open peer review and other innovations in scholarly publishing. As a personal note, I'd like to add that I have the privilege of working with Dr. Fitzpatrick in the MLA Publications Committee, of which I'm a member for a 3-year term. And she will talk with you about an area of expertise, digital publishing, but she also manages to walk that very important line between digital publishing, book publishing, that is in traditional print, and everything in between. Please help me welcome Dr. Kathleen Fitzpatrick.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here today. I'm really, really glad to get the opportunity to talk with you a bit about the digital humanities. I should probably confess that this title is somewhat misleading. It gives you a sense that my entire talk is going to focus on this thing that gets referred to as the digital humanities. I do some work in the beginning here, as you will hear, to kind of think through what's going on in digital humanities right now. But then I do sort of sidetrack into questions about scholarly communication and where the digital is beginning to impact the humanities writ large. So we're going to take a bit of a tour through this notion of the intersection of the digital and the humanities today. Starting with this thing, digital humanities, and what it is that goes by this name today in the academy. And this is a term that seems to be everywhere of late. It gets used a lot. If you look at the job list, the MLA job list of late, there are lots and lots of positions that are being advertised that ask for some relevant work in digital humanities. And yet, what exactly that means, I mean, sometimes even those ads don't quite seem to have a clear sense of what it is that they're asking for. So I want to start out, for what it's worth, by giving you my definition of this term. which is that the digital humanities represents a nexus of fields within which scholars use computing technologies to investigate the kinds of questions that are traditional to the humanities, right? So they're using computers in order to process large amounts of cultural material, in order to ask questions about the kinds of things that scholars of language and literature and history and other fields within the humanities have long been interested in. Or on the other hand, they're asking, and this is more true of my own work, they're asking traditional kinds of humanities-oriented questions about computing technologies, right? So whether it's using the computer technologies to ask the questions or asking the questions of those technologies, there's nonetheless this sort of merger or overlap of the humanities with these new technologies that comes together in this term. Now, the term digital humanities has a history that's been detailed by my friend Matt Kirschenbaum. The field, which was originally, in fact, known as humanities computing, had been around for some decades when, in 2001, Susan Schreibman, Ray Siemens, and John Unsworth, who were three of its key practitioners, entered into discussions with Blackwell Publishing about editing a volume for them, which was prospectively to be entitled A Companion to Humanities Computing. Now, Blackwell wanted a title that might appeal to a wider range of humanists, fearing that something called humanities computing was going to have a very small purchase out there, quite literally. And so they proposed that the title instead be A Companion to Digitized Humanities. The editors were not terribly thrilled with this. They were afraid that it was going to make it sound as though the thing that was humanities computing was really just about rendering stuff digital, right? Taking books and scanning them or what have you. So they countered with digital humanities, right? And thus it became, thanks to Blackwell, the name of this field. And so this name, I mean, I think it's not at all incidental that it gets born out of negotiations with the publisher. It sort of stuck, right? In addition to this volume, which does some really interesting work in terms of laying out, you know, the history of the field as it had developed to this point and the key technologies that were being used within humanities computing circles at that point in 2004. There are dozens, aside from this, of other resources that are available for thinking through what the digital humanities are and what's going on in the field today. There is, for starters, a really, at times, kind of surprisingly good Wikipedia page, which actually does a good job of describing some of the basic objectives of the field and also has a really wide range of links to resources in and around what's going on in digital humanities. Digital humanities has at its disposal at this point a number of scholarly societies, including the Association for Computers and the Humanities in the US and its partner association, the European Association for Digital Humanities. These two organizations and several other such organizations worldwide are linked via the Alliance of Digital Humanities Organizations. And this umbrella group is key in producing an extraordinarily successful annual conference called Digital Humanities. There are, in addition to the conference, there are journals, including LLC, which is, the title has actually been changed to LLC. It is no longer Literary and Linguistic Computing because it is attempting to reach beyond solely those fields of the literary and the linguistic. There's also Digital Humanities Quarterly, which is an open access online journal that focuses on digital humanities. There is also, under ordinary circumstances at least, a federal granting agency in the US that's charged with supporting the digital humanities when the government, you know, runs. The Office of Digital Humanities has done a really remarkable amount to support what we think of as the digital humanities today, particularly through their digital startup grant program. Very small but very targeted grants that are designed to get folks to test out crazy new ideas. They do not have to necessarily work, but they do have to be instructive. And that instructiveness has really produced a whole lot of fantastic innovation in the field in the last several years. Now, given the ways that computing has developed over the last several decades, it's not entirely surprising, I suppose, that much of the work that's come out of the digital humanities has focused for large part on computing methods that can be applied to textual materials. These were the first objects that were really digitized in bulk, and so these were where the interests of humanities computing first went. Now, some of these projects have been archival in nature, attempting to produce digital corpora for scholarly study, including projects like the William Blake Archive or the Rossetti Archive. But there are also projects in digital humanities that focus on producing tools and technical standards to support the production and the maintenance of these kinds of archives. And this has been another key source of digital humanities work, including projects like the Text Encoding Initiative or the Text Image Linking Environment, right? These are both technical tools that enable the production of the kinds of archives that digital humanists have been interested in. So whether these DH scholars are producing tools or archives, however, their research outputs are often not at all traditional. These are very frequently projects that simply cannot be flattened out into journal articles or monographs, but instead need to live openly and be used online. And as a result, there are a number of digital humanities projects that are designed to help these tools and archives become interoperable and to help facilitate the peer review of these non-traditional projects, right? Since something like the Blake Archive can't really be reviewed prior to publication, it can only be reviewed in use. New methods have to be brought to bear in terms of thinking about what constitutes peer review in these spaces. So projects like NINES, the Networked Infrastructure in 19th Century Scholarship, are working to both gather together and aggregate all of the resources in their fields that have been produced in these digital corpora, but also to help review all of those objects and ensure that those archives are the most functional that they can possibly be. Now, digital humanities is, of course, not solely located in literary studies departments. It is actually a very broadly humanities-based set of fields, including new modes of doing history and new forms of media studies. But it's at this point that we start seeing some of that complication in thinking about the definition of the digital humanities that I mentioned earlier. A project like Media Commons, which I'll end up talking a bit more about in a little while, isn't computational per se in the same way that something like the Blake Archive is. Instead, it focuses on using digital networks to produce new kinds of humanities scholarship, right? As well as taking a critical look at the operation of those digital networks themselves. And this shift really raises some key questions, not least whether the thing that calls itself digital humanities is the same as, or at least sort of overlaps with, the thing that we call digital media studies, or if these are distinct fields, how they're different and what the stakes of that difference are. Now, this confusion, I think, about the limits of the category digital humanities, and it is something that if you follow any digital humanities conversations through blogs, on Twitter, and so forth, it is a question that resurfaces again and again about what the limit of digital humanities might be, is in part why Bill Cronin, who at the time was the president-elect of the American Historical Association, in a Scholarly Communication Institute meeting in 2011, took issue with the use of the term digital humanities. He suggested that the term seems to suggest that there is some other branch of the humanities that's analog, right? And that therefore need not pay attention to the kinds of conversations that are taking place in the digital humanities. So he suggested that a better concept would in fact be the humanities in and for the digital age. Which begins to make clear that all fields and all subfields are affected by the new technologies that so many of us are using for communication and research. And my own work over the last several years has really been focused on getting those parts of the humanities that feel themselves to be most analog to recognize the ways in which we are all already digital, how the digital is changing all of our work, whether visibly or invisibly. And one of the primary arenas for this change is, of course, in scholarly communication. Now, given my job title, it's probably not a terrific surprise that I would say something like that. I joined the staff of the Modern Language Association in 2011 specifically in order to help the association and its members think about the kinds of changes that were taking place in scholarly communication across the profession, as scholars increasingly move from a sole focus on the production of books and journal articles to instead thinking about a much more fluid range of modes of communication in which we're engaging. And so I want to give you a bit of the background that explains a bit about how I came to these issues, a story that I think might in several ways be emblematic of the sorts of change that we're experiencing in the humanities today, before turning to talk a bit about where we at the MLA are headed. So, the short version of the recap. What feels like a very long time ago now, I finished a dissertation that focused on the relationship between the contemporary American novel and television. My PhD was in English, and I had been lucky enough to find a tenure-track job, and so I started doing the thing that an assistant professor in English does, right? I started the process of turning the dissertation into a book. And as I was doing so, I sent out queries to university presses to see who might be interested in publishing the thing. There really weren't quite that many of the queries. It just felt that way. And I worked and I waited. And the three presses that I was most interested in all said that they were interested too, and that I should send them the full manuscript as soon as it was ready. Now, unfortunately, as soon as it was ready, took a little bit longer than I was expecting. Beginning a new assistant professorship at a small liberal arts college, something that I am sure you can all recognize, took a good bit of my focus. And then there is, of course, the writing is hard part. Turning a dissertation into a book was just not as simple a process as I expected it to be. But it did finally get done, and 3 years after those initial queries, I started writing back to the presses that had expressed interest in the dissertation, not entirely realizing that the bursting of the dot-com bubble, which had happened in the interim, was going to have an effect. But it did. The response from all three presses was pretty much the same. This is a great project, but we can't afford to publish it right now. So I scrambled a bit and I sent out some more queries and I got more of the same response. One press finally did ask to see the manuscript though, and they did send it out to reviewers, and they got positive readers' reports, and they had an editor who was really enthusiastic about the project, but after holding on to it for nearly a year, the press finally declined. The editor had been overruled on the editorial board by the marketing guys, who said that the project posed too much financial risk to pursue in the current economy. Sadly, that is a direct quote. This particular cause for rejection produced two immediate responses among the people around me to whom I was talking about this thing. The first of which was most clearly articulated by my mother, who said they were planning on making money off of your book. Right, exactly. And thanks, Mom. The fact is they were, right? Not much, perhaps, but that the press involved needed the book to make money, at least enough to return its costs, and that it doubted that it would, highlights the serious economic problems that scholarly publishing continues to face today. I mean, there's no small irony in the fact that I was facing this situation, though, as the argument that I had made in this book was precisely that the book is not a dying form, right? And that claims that it is often serve quite conservative ends, shoring up very traditional cultural hierarchies against infiltration by mass culture, right? And yet here I am, suddenly left wondering whether the academic book might in fact be facing a kind of death, one that had less to do with any decline in our need for it, perhaps, than in our ability to support it going forward. Now, there is a happy ending to this story. As it turns out, after another year and a half of sending out fruitless queries, I finally did find a fabulous press to publish the book with, Vanderbilt University Press. But the whole intervening mess still had me wondering whether there might be a better way, right? After all, right after I had finished the revisions on the manuscript, so a full 3 years before the book came, I take it back, 4 years before the book came out, feeling somewhat impatient about wanting to get ideas out there now, I started a blog. Right? And that blog, which is now a little over 11 years old, helped me develop an audience, a community, in fact, well before any of my traditional publications started drawing any attention. So while the first response to the rejection I'd received was my mother's somewhat bewildered disbelief, The second response was instead about possibilities. As my friend Matt Kirschenbaum asked me in a comment on a blog post that I'd written about the entire debacle, why couldn't I just take the manuscript and the 2 positive readers' reports and publish the whole thing online, right? Voila, peer-reviewed publication. Now, Matt, in his comment, backed down from that possibility, saying that he understood why it wasn't realistic. But honestly, I didn't. I mean, why not start a new kind of online publishing network, one that might actually learn from the dynamic communities that blogging had created? Why not remake scholarly publishing into something that actually works? Now, if you're thinking that this makes me sound like some kind of starry-eyed optimist, you may not be entirely wrong. The connections that I had found through this early community of academic bloggers gave me a great deal of hope. I mean, these were really supportive colleagues with whom I was working, who came together and sort of pushed one another in thinking ideas through. Blogging in those early days helped me forge this sort of little utopian intentional community, and maybe, I thought, some of the things that I'd found there could be generalized outward. So, working with the Institute for the Future of the Book, my co-editor Avi Santo and I founded Media Commons, which is a network in which scholars in media studies could share and discuss their work and develop new collaborations, all at something closer to the speed at which media actually moves. Media Commons has been up and running for the better part of 6 years at this point, and we've developed a number of projects there, including In Media Res, which asks 5 scholars a week to comment very briefly on some up-to-the-minute media text as a means of opening discussion about the issues that it presents for media scholars, students, practitioners, and activists. Similarly, The New Everyday is an experiment in middle state publishing, focusing on articles that are more formal and developed than blog posts, but not yet quite as sealed into the fixity of the journal article. Alt Academy similarly remediates the edited volume as a space for lengthier discussion about a particular issue, and as a space where that discussion can grow and extend beyond its own borders. And finally, Media Commons Press is publishing longer texts, including monographs for open discussion. Now, working on Media Commons has been extremely gratifying, but it's made clear to me how difficult changing a culture can be. Getting scholars, administrators, publishers, and institutions to invest their time, effort, and resources in new ways of working requires, in many cases, really changing the ways that they think, right? Changing the things that they prioritize, and changing the ways that they attribute value to the products of academic labor. In other words, I gradually came to realize that the primary changes that needed to be made in the academy today were less technological than they were social. Right? New publishing networks needed to be accompanied by new understandings of the purposes of scholarly communication and the ways that it might best be facilitated today. So I started doing a bunch of writing on the blog and elsewhere about how humanities scholars working in and for the digital age might think differently about things like peer review, about the nature of authorship, about the shape of scholarly texts, and so forth. And all of this writing finally culminated in Planned Obsolescence, which, as you heard, did come out from NYU Press in 2011. And yes, in print. And yes, I do see the irony in that. But it is, again, the humanities that still thinks of itself as being analog that I really felt I most needed to reach with this argument. So in any case, just as I'm finishing up that book, this extremely weird thing happened, or at least it's very weird within the humanities. Someone came up to me and said, hey, these are some really interesting ideas you have here. Let's find out if they work. So the MLA founded the Office of Scholarly Communication through a collaboration with the Executive Council of the Association, and it charged the new office with bringing together and reimagining the association's book publishing program and its web editorial functions. The new structure and our thinking here, excuse me, about scholarly communication is meant to grapple with the growing understanding that scholarly communication, in that sense that's broader than publishing per se, is the very foundation of what scholarly societies do, right? The very purpose since the Royal Society of London for which they have been founded. And so given that, the new office touches every part of the organization, from its continuing publishing activities to member relations to policy to the convention. The office has two primary responsibilities, however. The first of which is to think about the future of our book publications as our means of production and distribution become increasingly digital. And the second is to think about the born digital platforms for the new kinds of communication in which our members will want to engage and will need us to support in order to facilitate their developing scholarly practices. Now, the relatively easy part of that first area involves exploring the ways that our print projects might best circulate as ebooks, right? As well as taking projects that to this point have only existed in print and thinking about how the digital might enable new and better kinds of interaction with them. So, for example, last year we conducted the first New Variorum Shakespeare Digital Challenge, in which we released the XML from our most recent Variorum volume, The Comedy of Errors, under a Creative Commons license online, and encouraged digital scholars to download it and to produce the most exciting interface or API or visualization that they could imagine with it. And we've just announced a second round of this competition in which we're seeking this time mashups of our data. We've also released another volume, The Winter's Tale, under the same Creative Commons license. But we're seeking mashups of our data with that of other open Shakespeare projects that are available online. And so we're hoping that this kind of experimentation will enable us to see more of the future possibilities for the Variorum and how it might grow and develop online. Now, there is, of course, a lot that remains to be figured out on this end of our charge. Huge questions about sustainable business models and open access loom large ahead of us, but at least we sort of know what those questions are, right? The other half of the charge of the Office of Scholarly Communication is a good bit more complicated and a good bit more fuzzy. Not only are these born digital platforms themselves always in development, but their adoption requires a new perspective on the role of the scholarly society in the digital age. I mean, it's possible, for instance, that the locus of the value of the scholarly society is shifting from providing members with closed access to the products of the society to instead facilitating the broadly open distribution of the work that's being done by its members. And this is a really massive change, not just for the society, but for the members themselves. From a situation in which you join a society in order to get its journal, to instead one in which you join in order to get your work out to the world. So we've chosen to begin thinking about these born digital platforms and how they might create new relationships with and among our members by building MLA Commons, which is a platform that we launched last January 2013, at our annual convention in Boston. Now, MLA Commons is designed to support a very wide range of forms of member-to-member communication, collaboration, feedback, and publishing. And we're extremely grateful to have received support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation for this work. And we're also benefiting quite extraordinarily from the generosity of the CUNY Academic Commons team from the CUNY Graduate Center. The Academic Commons, which they had originally built for their purposes, is an extremely robust platform for complex forms of scholarly communication. The Academic Commons links all of the faculty and graduate students at all of the many CUNY campuses all around New York. And the CUNY team has now taken the platform that they built for themselves and generalized it into what they call the Commons in a Box, for which the MLA is one of the first major partners. The Commons software is entirely open source. The base platform is the popular blog engine WordPress, and it's running with the BuddyPress plugin on top of it, which creates a sort of social networking layer on top of the multi-site blogging network. And the Commons team has its eye on what its project can give back to these developer communities. We at the MLA, in turn, are working toward the goal of generalizing the model that we're developing. We're now in the planning stages of the second phase of development of MLA Commons, which is to expand it into a more generalized humanities commons and invite other scholarly societies to participate with us in federating a sort of common network in which truly interdisciplinary collaborations can take place. Any member of the MLA can currently activate their account on the Commons, and with that account they can create a profile, and the profile allows them to join discussion groups, to publish an individual blog or work on a group blog, to post and share documents, to work collaboratively on projects, and a whole range of other things besides. The underlying structure of the Commons is that of the group. Right? Groups can be open or closed membership, they can do their work openly or in private. Commons groups can support the work of, for instance, MLA committees, who all have spaces within the network. It can support the work of the existing divisions and discussion groups that members join within the organization. And it can also support the work of ad hoc groups of scholars who come together around particular projects. And this in particular, we believe, will enable us to begin developing a much more fluid structure for the organization itself, as discussion groups will be able to sort of form and reform and fade away as needed. So this group structure serves the need for internal communication within the association, the members talking amongst themselves. While the blogs at MLA Commons serve the need for open communication between the association and a broader range of publics. These blogs can serve as individual or as group outlets at a range of levels of formality, from casual scholarly blogging to more structured publications. And so in this way, we're hoping to really encourage our members to create new kinds of collaborative projects, for which we're attempting to do a bit of modeling, in part through our first entirely open, digitally edited, or entirely open, digital edited volume, Literary Studies in the Digital Age. Well, this project, which brings together work by a group of leaders in the digital humanities, and thinking back to that Blackwell anthology, one of the editors on that volume was Ray Siemens. He is a co-editor on this one as well. But one of the things that we're really excited about this volume is sort of labeled in its subtitle, right? This is an evolving anthology. As the editors have put out a call in the context of the anthology itself for new entries and for new work to connect to this project. So we're hoping that the collection will continue to grow and change over time. Now, through new modes of publication such as this, we're really thinking explicitly about how a network like MLA Commons might be a way that scholarly societies can help further the goals of open access, further realizing the value that they provide to their members by helping them get their work out to the world as broadly as possible, where it can have the greatest possible public benefit and produce the greatest possible interest in the kinds of work that's being done today in the humanities. But given, again, that my continued belief that the primary problem that needs to be solved in scholarly communication today is less a technical problem than a social one, we still have a number of key challenges ahead of us. Most particularly, we need to keep our thank you. Always happy when people recognize this slide. We need to keep our focus on how we can create buy-in amongst the membership for using this platform. I mean, other scholarly societies have attempted to roll out varying kinds of platforms for scholarly communication, only to discover that if you build it, they will not necessarily come. Right? User space profile fatigue, right? Just one more thing I have to keep up to date. And those, I mean, we're interestingly in this weird position between two cultures. On the one hand, there are scholars who don't yet recognize that they have a need for a digital platform like this one, and so don't gravitate toward it automatically. And on the other hand, there are those scholars who recognize the significance of the digital platform, but feel that their needs have already been met through whatever platforms they're already working on. Thank you very much. And so getting those early adopters to come join us is something of a challenge. As a result, we're trying to imagine MLA Commons as being part of an extended experiment in which we're doing ongoing testing trying to gather more information about what it is that our members do and don't need in the platform. We have discovered over the last several weeks that if you launch an extremely controversial document in a place that's really allows for rich discussion, you can get a lot of people to come talk about it. So finding ways to really draw people in and let them know that that kind of conversation can be continued. It's not just about this document, is one of the things that we're working on right now. We're also working very extensively with some of those early adopters that I mentioned. I'm really trying to help them to help us, right? To get them to create some exciting content and to demonstrate what the platform can do by pressing at its edges and trying to find some of the broken spots. We're talking a great deal these days about how we can get our members to come build the kind of community that I found in those early blogging days, and how we might genuinely get them to feel like this platform is their own. My sense is that a network like MLA Commons will come of age at the point when its users begin to do things with it that we never could have predicted. The question is how best to enable them to imagine those possibilities. And in the end, that space of possibility, right, that kind of open exchange of genuine communication may be the key to the future of the humanities. What it is that we want more than anything at the MLA is to really facilitate the open social development of a humanities that is not just digital, right? That is not just thinking about computing technologies applied to the humanities or humanities questions about computing technologies, but that is really genuinely of and for a digital age, that recognizes the way that all of our work is and will continue to grow in conjunction with these new technologies. So I will just leave it there. Thank you very much for coming out, and I look forward to talking more with you.